I hope there's places for everybody since there's a tasting involved here, but please get seated if you can, and we want to get underway. We have a relatively long program here on a very, very important topic. And by the way, I'm Ted Castile. I'm a Polk County grower, and I've been involved in our research program now for, well, I don't know, a very long time, more 3.5 decades, maybe, something like that. And so Patty has asked me to introduce this topic very briefly to give you the kind of long view that in terms of this whole issue of crop management that's been obviously something we've been concerned about almost, but not quite from the very beginning of our industry. Let me get my notes here. I'm on page 3 instead of page 1, but just take a second. I entered the Oregon wine industry in the 1970s, the late 1970s. Actually, there are people here who were here 10 years longer than me, and they're still standing, which is good. When we got started, there were really a lot more questions than answers. One of the first research endeavors that our industry got started on was TWRB, was the Table Wine Research Advisory Board. It was the first institution established to help finance our research. And it was the phenological sites. And at Bethel Heights we had one, and they were scattered around the industry. They were little plantations of many varieties. And I had Zinfandel and Portuguese Blue and a whole lot of other varieties which were growing and grew in our phenological site. And the goal was to decide once and for all, or at least for a while, what varieties would be most successful in Oregon. And so that was sort of the beginning. And as we moved into the 80s, we were also concerned about not only what varieties, but where to source the very best plant material, vineyard architecture, all of the questions that attend a new wine region in terms of doing things the best we could. And we also consulted regions around the world, wine regions around the world, the French, the Kiwis, the Australians, all sorts of people to try to learn as much as we could. Read a lot of scientific literature and all that in our search to find the answers. But needless to say, in these early years, there weren't many of us. There were a lot of little commercial vineyards, not too many wineries. And it was true that there was virtually no crop thinning going on during that period of time. Pinot Noir was selling for about $500 a ton. And there were two kinds of years, because we were letting Mother Nature decide whether it was going to be a great year or a big year. And as a grower, I wanted it to be a big year, not necessarily a great year. But two vintages that would illustrate that would be 83. We had 50 acres of wine grapes, and off those 50 acres, because of a horrible rainy June, we ended up with 23 tons. Very disappointing, and at $500 a ton, we were digging pretty deep into our pockets to find out how we were going to do things the next year. It was followed by 84, which still remains in my mind and the minds of many people who are around as the absolute worst year in Oregon viticultural history. We set an enormous crop. We bloomed in the middle of July, set this enormous crop. At the beginning of September, it started to rain. It never stopped. The birds came by the thousands, and we got almost 3 tons to the acre off our vineyard. And the wine was not very dark or intense, but it was a grower year, just to illustrate. So during that period of time, we began to think about the issue of crop management. There really wasn't much going on in terms of research on that topic at Oregon State, but the conversation had begun, and we were fortunate during that period of time, along with these conversations, to have in general, over that long period, the 80s, several really successful vintages because they were short vintages. 83, 85, and then 3 short years in a row in 88, 89, and 90. And those years were all, we made excellent wine. The critics started to get interested in Oregon. There was a lot of encouragement to get better and better at what we were doing. And by the end of the decade, we were very energized to take on this crop management thing in a serious way. And in the 1990s then, a lot of intellectual energy was spent trying to figure it out, trying to even out our vintages and to make good wine even in the most challenging years. And along the way there, the people at Bethel Heights wandered into a collaborative group. Ken Wright was part of it, and a few other colleagues, where we really did scour the literature. There'd been work done in the 80s at the Hebrew University in Israel, Cleaver in California, other places, and we learned from them. We traveled not only to Burgundy, but other places trying to figure this all out. And toward the end of that decade, the 90s, we had a series of protocols that began to be developed kind of informally in the industry. OSU was not much help during that period of time on the topic, that became more widely adopted through the industry about how much thinning was enough thinning to get a response, what to take off, all the questions that were attended it, the whole issue of crop balance across the whole vine, all these questions. And by the end of the 90s, these things were in place, and I would say, quite honestly, it actually did make a difference in terms of our ability to deal, especially with more troubling and challenging vintages. And then, about 10 years ago, we hired a new extension specialist, Patty Skinkis, and she came along and really insisted that we subject these protocols to the scrutiny of academic science. And that was the beginning then of the road that got us here. First of all, she went to Stoller Vineyard and did a lot of scientific work there. And Stoller, a very favored site in the Dundee Hills at lower elevation. But the concern was raised that, we found an answer for Stoller, but have we really found an answer for the rest of us? And so what Patty finally decided, and for many of us, we agreed to cooperate, was to extend this research out into 15 or 20 vineyards throughout the state. So that as we did our work, we would find an answer that not just stood for Stoller, but to some extent, provided answers for all of us. And so that was the genesis of the statewide crop load trial that's about ready to go into its 6th year this year, where we all do help Patty. Our vineyards have been selected partly because we professionally managed, I guess would be a good way to put it, those kinds of vineyards. And we go out and we become her RAs in the field. That is, we do all of the counting and weighing and all the rest of it that ordinarily somebody have to be hired to do. And therefore, it provides the ability for a much wider coverage in terms of the quality of the answers, and it costs a whole lot less. I would guess that this project would cost at least $150,000 a year, but we're doing it for $40,000 because we all participate. We pay for a lot of the extra stuff that has to happen. ETS and Gallo have been very good about providing free analysis and all the rest of it. And we're here today to find out the results, at least to this point, and we hope to do this for 10 years, by the way. So we have really about 5 years to go. We'll see. But in any case, it's a very worthy endeavor. There's lots to like about it as far as I'm concerned. First of all, I like the idea that our research is not just the kind of research that's dreamed up in a corner of the ivory tower in Corvallis, where somebody's got a question. They may not even be doing it for us, but for some sort of academic reason. And it may be done at the Botany Farm in Corvallis on River Bottom. Here we have it done in our industry, and our industry is very deeply involved in its execution, which I think makes it a very laudable endeavor. Secondly, these farms, these vineyards will be around after this project is done, perhaps to host other similar kinds of things. We have a yearly conference, a whole day conference. We all attend, everybody who participates. And there's a lively discussion, and we have the opportunity to learn from each other, even though the identity of the wines and all that are kept private. And the other great thing that happens is that this project goes all the way from the beginning of the season to the wines that are in front of you. And they're also evaluated by professionals so that we can see the real outcome where it counts, and that is in the glass. And finally, I would say this, that the wine board is always very interested in what they call ROI, return on investment, in terms of where your research dollars are being invested. And in my own experience, for instance, I farm 100 acres. We own 100 acres of vineyard. And if I only got 1/4 of a ton per acre more from my vineyard as a consequence of what we've learned from this, that's $75,000 a year more that goes into my pocket, or that money that I did not have to spend. And we had a meeting about this not long ago, talking with other people of my generation, and a lot of them have already changed their practices. And it's their estimation that it's millions and millions of dollars because of what we learned here already that is being saved by our industry because of the knowledge that has come from the Statewide Crop Load Project. So here to tell you the nuts and bolts of all this in terms of the science, to see the data and all the rest of it, is our extension specialist, Dr. Patty Skinkis.
Well, thank you, Ted, for that wonderful historic perspective, especially for a number of people I see in the room that are younger than myself, so that it could enjoy that perspective. Just a little bit of setup here. I'm going to talk about the project first, and then we've got a panel of the winemakers and viticulturists that were actually part of the project here to talk about the wines after. So, we'll be getting to the tasting later. I'm sure many of you are anxious about that. But to start out with, I want to give a little bit more history. This history is based on the reported yields that have come into the state, and many of you get asked to fill out this survey every year about how many tons you produce and all that sort of information. It's really important. People like myself use this for understanding what's going on out there in the industry. And this is the past 26 years of yield data reported through the Vineyard and Winery report. And what you can see here is that we've got a lot of vintage variation that's been happening for quite some time. Certainly we know, and this has got Pinot Noir, which is the black line, and the gray line is all other varieties put together. We see a lot of variation there, and specifically if we look at the range of yields over that 26-year period, we've got a pretty narrow window of our yields that we've been producing from Pinot Noir. The 26-year mean is 2.2 tons per acre. But during that time, we've been having a lot of changes. We've been doing viticulture differently from the 90s to the 2000s, and even today. More plant density per acre, that should mean more yield per acre, but we still see really restricted yields. Obviously, yield management became a central focus during that time. And of course, the highest yield on record has been relatively recently, 2014 and 15, and many of us remember this because it was only a couple of years ago, and that could be because of warm seasons, people wanting to hedge their bets on a bit more inventory in stock, especially after pretty low vintages of 2012 and 13, but we see some shift there. Whether it's because of this project, not sure, but it also is probably because of the vintages we've had. So management of Pinot Noir yield is very critical or central to managing quality for Oregon. And the reasons to cluster thin are varied. I think when I first started this project, I was thinking more as a strict viticulturist from a research perspective, thinking only of what the vine would do, but really there's a lot of other reasons that people would crop thin. Hastening ripening was the number one, simply because we have a cool season. Increasing fruit quality has always been the top reason. Decreasing botrytis, especially in those cool years like 2010 and 2011. Sustained vine health and balance. Now, from a viticulture or vine physiology perspective, that's what we're always focused on, but that's not necessarily the main focus of production reality. And of course, target inventory. So how much can you really process in your winery? So yield reduction on average, from asking growers how they do their yield management, ranges from 20 to 50% on an annual basis. And my best guess from talking to growers is that based on today's labor costs, it can be anywhere from $700 to $800 an acre per year spent on crop thinning alone. A couple of years ago, we did a yield management survey of the industry, and we were trying to get a gauge before we set out on the Statewide Crop Load Project. And we found that 89% of respondents said they crop thin their vineyards, focusing largely on Pinot Noir. They didn't concern themselves as much with yield management in other varieties. And about 67% said they had the same exact target ranges of 2 to 2.75 tons per acre. The number one reason that they were crop thinning was to enhance quality, but didn't really give much more information beyond that. So then we decided, as a research team, could we be managing yields better? We know we have diverse vineyards. We know we have diverse plantings. Why don't we have a more diverse or a bigger range in our yields? So I formed a group of, obviously, industry collaborators, but also collaborators at OSU and the USDA. So James Osborne, the extension enologist, Elizabeth Tomasino, the sensory scientist, Paul Schreiner, a plant physiologist with USDA, and then most recently Katie McLaughlin, who is a new statistician in the OSU Department of Statistics, who has just joined this project and is very excited about running multi-year big data sets from this work. So to better manage the yields, we at the outset of this project, we met with industry and really designed it to be a project that would be suitable for them. So I didn't dream up the rules and say, here, go do this. We actually met a couple years in advance. I think our first meetings were in 2010. And then the first time we actually implemented the trial was in 2012. So our goal was, can we engage industry as direct researchers as part of this project? A lot of my research colleagues said I was crazy, and it was a lot of risk at hand, but I thought, well, I'm an extension specialist, so I think I can take that risk to work with the industry. And our goal for the science was really understanding crop level, the site characteristics that play into that, as well as the vintage variation, and how that all plays not only for wine quality, but sustainability. How are we going to overcrop our vines? Are we going to have more problems? We didn't know about red blotch when we started this. Is red blotch going to play into these sorts of things? And that's what we hope we can try to address, some of those multiple angles of the research. And really, at the end, to hopefully come up with some dynamic metrics that we can figure out how to better balance crop level based on what the vines can do, what the site can do, what the vine can do, and really also matching that with production economics, knowing that not everybody will have the same target for all of their fruit to the same bottle price of wine. So at the outset of this project, we solicited collaboration with industry, and much to my surprise, it was that a lot of the industry joined up pretty quickly. Our first year we had 10 collaborators, and over the last 5 years we've had more than 20 or around 20 companies join the project, and we've had on average between 12 and 13 vineyards in any given year take part in this. It's called the Statewide Crop Load Project because we're always welcoming new people, and since we have 5 more years left, anybody who's interested in this at the end, please talk to me. We currently are only in the Willamette Valley, but that's because of who's come forward as volunteers to join this effort. But we are across 5 AVAs. And each of the vineyards that is part of this project, they've taken this project very seriously. They've followed protocols that we've set out so that it is set up as a true experimental design in a much larger fashion than we normally would do it at an experimental farm at OSU. And they have a randomized complete block design. So the 2 or 3 or more crop levels that they choose to do in their vineyard have to be replicated spatially and replicated at least 3 times. This requires between 1 and 3 acre blocks in a given vineyard that they're dedicating for this research. We have outline protocols that everybody follows to collect all of the data. And then within these whole vine sections or whole vine rows, they're collecting data from subsample vines that are usually about 10 vine sections. The treatment levels we chose to go with after, I think, many debates was going with a very simple thinning regime. So 1 cluster per shoot, 2 cluster per shoot, 1.5 clusters per shoot, and half clusters per shoot. Very few people do that, but that just want to signify is one cluster every other shoot. It's not actually cutting clusters in half. And in the beginning, it was a real hard sell to have people include a true control of no thinning. So I went back to the data and looked, and only a couple people were braved it the first year, but now by year 3, the majority had switched away from going to 2 clusters per shoot and included a no thinning true control in their study. So about half the vineyards have the no thinning comparator or a 2 cluster. But I saw that most people were kind of warming up to the idea of just doing a full crop, essentially, not thinning anymore. So the data collection that goes on, like Ted said, that this data collection is actually being done by the collaborators in the project. It's not, I don't have an entourage of students or FRAs that go out to collect all of this, but we do help gather the data. Sometimes it's like herding cats, but they're friendly cats, so that's good. And we look at a lot of other things than just yield and just fruit composition. So we start out with fruitfulness in spring. We want to see if there is an impact over time by overcropping, if we are seeing a reduction in basically our fruiting potential, our yield potential. Leg phase, we collect the normal leg phase data, cluster weights, cluster counts. That's also when our cluster thinning is conducted. At veraison, we take nutrient samples. We want to see, are we overcropping these vines? Are we going to shift our nutrient demands over time? And are we going to have to now add more to vineyards if we do increase our yield? So we've been monitoring macro and micronutrients from the veraison, leaf blade, and petiole samples. And then at harvest, we collect fruit. We get the yield metrics, the fruit samples are collected, and ETS has donated the service for the last 5 years to run the basic juice panel as well as the rapid phenolic panel for all of the treatments, which is amazingly generous and very helpful for us to understand fruit composition. In winter, we collect pruning weights to get the vine size data. And then new as of 2015, we've been gathering growing degree day or air temperature data from each vineyard. We didn't have that in the beginning, but as we started to put together additional funding, I could scrape together some temperature loggers to put in each vineyard, so we're starting to do that. And then we have a phenology report that's given to us from each of the vineyards so that we can now track GDD as well as phenology and start looking at how those sorts of things are impacting what result we get from the different vineyard sites. So this is just a quick overview of some of the fruit composition. This is not all of what is measured in the fruit, but I'm going to spend a bit more time today because you're going to be looking at the wines or tasting the wines today. I wanted to talk a bit more about what the fruit composition is. For sake of time, I'm not going to go into details about nutrient impact or about the other vine physiological components. It's going to be mainly the yield and the fruit composition impact. So for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to show you pages that look like this. No, I'm joking. This is just an example of one site, the summary at our annual meeting. Each collaborating vineyard gets the stats for their individual project. Because basically this is a project that's replicated across many vineyards. We run the reports for them so they see what were the statistical results for their vineyard. But I'm going to talk about all years so far and all sites and kind of summarize it that way. So before I start, I wanted to show you some of the seasonal heat units that we've had over the last 5 years from 2012 to 2016. And this is just an example of what we were looking at for the cumulative heat units across the season and where the phenology landed. So you can see we've got a lot of vintage variation there, not only in our cumulative heat units, but also in where our phenological stages fell for the different years. And so these are summarized across all vineyards within the project, and they could be as much as a month difference between the 5 years. And this is just specifically looking at 2016 as an example. We started putting in these air temperature loggers in all of the sites, and this is a plot of the accumulated heat units for 2016, and it's broken down by the phenological stages of these sites. I have some of these vineyards coded, so I have identity to those. And then it also has an overlay of the dot above it is the heat units for the whole April 1 to November 1. So there, you can see there's some variability there, but not a ton of variability across sites in a given year. It's about anywhere from 200 to 400 heat units difference by the time they get to harvest. And this is a 2016 and 2015 data from the different sites. You can see there's obviously a difference there, but over top of those, we have the plot of the bar graphs. We have the bricks that were reported for that year, keeping in mind that, of course, harvest is a decision made based on the winemaker. It's not based on a phenological stage, so we were anticipating some variability there, but it wasn't going to be driven necessarily by Mother Nature. But across those two seasons, you can see generally the lower brick sites are those that had the lower heat unit accumulation by the time they got to harvest. But it just shows you some appreciation for the variability of the vineyards in the project. Now, in terms of yield across the last 5 years, and this pretty much matches what I think most people would remember for the different vintages, we have quite a bit of variability. This actually is a plot of all the yield that comes in from the different crop levels. So you see the error bars are quite large there. That's because we are controlling yield. The mean is the orange dot there. And this is, you'll see the yield I report is pounds per linear foot. I don't talk about tons because we're working with, a number of different vineyards. They have different spacing, and if I talk tons per acre, it would mean different things at different locations. So it's all reported in pounds per linear foot. So if we look at the different treatments, so we look at the years and the year effect and the different treatment, what was the kind of difference that we're seeing here? So I'm setting the stage for you to understand what differences we see or that we don't see based on crop level. So these are the different treatment levels based on number of clusters per shoot. And this was the percentage of decrease from full crop. That on average, the 5-year average was reducing crop level by that much. So most people were doing the 1 cluster per shoot, 1.5 cluster per shoot, and the 2 cluster or no thin treatments in their project sites. And most often, the 2 cluster per shoot and the no thin are very similar. So when we go to do the statistics, sometimes the yields aren't very different statistically, and then the fruit quality data is not very different, and that's because our average fruitfulness is usually around 1.8 or 2 clusters. So the no thin is only really different from the 2 cluster by removal of wings. But in heavy crop years, even the 1.5 cluster per shoot would oftentimes have very similar yields. And comparing the 1 cluster per shoot and the no thin, which are the two kind of the most commonly replicated treatments across sites, comparing what those are from a pounds per linear foot perspective, this is what we get over the years. It's dictated, of course, by cluster size and fruit set by any given year. But I did put this in terms of tons per acre using just 1245 vines per acre, just to give you an example of what kind of difference we're seeing there. So in most years, we're looking at about a 1 ton difference when we're crop thinning. 2015 was the exception. It was almost 3 ton difference by just going down to 1 cluster per shoot. So very big crop year. And we would anticipate, because of that, potentially bigger impacts of crop thinning that year. So this is a display of the summary of all the ANOVAs, or analysis of variance, looking at, do these yield levels have differences based on a given vineyard? So it's the count. We counted up how many vineyards had a difference in Brix, PHTA, and where you see a highlighted cell is where I said, okay, if 30% of the sites have this I'll call it important, just because we weren't seeing more than 30% of the sites having much. We weren't seeing like 100% of the sites showing a definitive impact on Brix, for example. So if we want to look at the basic ripening, so Brix, PHTA, the 2 years where we saw the greatest impact was in 2014 and 15, our biggest crop years. They were also the warm years, but we did see an impact. Crop thinning did reduce or did help increase Brix. But if you also look there, pH and TA were not really altered too much. So in those years, people would have said, I'm going to hold on to more crop. It's going to help me preserve my acids. It didn't necessarily do that. It did that in only a few sites. It certainly did boost the Brix up those years. And to give you an example of why that may be or why not, that we see some of this, is probably best to look at it across the basic ripening across all vineyards. So what I have here is 2012, 13, 14, and 15. I didn't have all of the data for 2016 to run these yet, but this is based on crop load. So rather than just looking at yield, we looked at yield divided by pruning weight. So recognizing that bigger vineyards or bigger sized vines may be able to hold heavier crop, and wanted to look at how that could be influencing Brix, pH, and TA at harvest. And one of the things you can see here, if you look at these, is if you look at the blue line, you're looking at the slope, and as you increase crop level, usually your crop load will also increase. And then we see that certainly Brix does have the greatest relationship in 2015, but some years there's no relationship at all. So 2013, 2014, very small relationship. pH, there's flat lines there. There's not a strong relationship between changing your crop level. TA, some years, like 2015 didn't really make a difference, but 2012 and 2013, the greater the yield was, you did have a reduction in your in the TA. So it makes a difference, but it really is dependent on year. Now the other component that we found probably even more so being impacted by crop thinning was anthocyanin. And this has been found in some other studies where you may not have a major impact on basic ripening, but you have an impact on color. And certainly color is important for Pinot Noir. And we started to see that we had, on average, anywhere from 3 to 4 sites each year showing a relationship with decreasing yield increases anthocyanin. So we saw that for most years except for 2016. 2016 was one of the years we didn't see that happening, but usually total anthocyanin in between 10 and 40 sites, we were seeing that relationship. Crop thinning led to higher anthocyanin, and usually that's generally a higher wine quality. Polymeric anthocyanin, which is a very small percentage of the total, but considered a much more stable form of anthocyanin, we saw that to be impacted at 20 to 40% or 42% of sites over that 2012 to 2015. And higher yielding years seem to have greater impact. So 2014, 2015, we seem to have a better impact of that than some other years. And what was the change? Across the board, the average was about a 171 milligram increase in total anthocyanin and a 2.2 milligram increase in polymeric anthocyanin by crop thinning. And there were 3 sites in particular that started to show consistent effect over 3 years, which I was getting excited about. If they were just one and it was going all over the board, then we wouldn't really know what to make of that. But we started seeing a consistent trend. So here's the crop load effect across 12, 13, 14, and 15. We see that certain years, 2015, 2014, 2012, if you had more yield relative, or less yield rather relative to your vine size, you had an increase in your anthocyanin, or conversely, with your increased crop load, higher yield relative to your vine size, we saw a reduction in total anthocyanin. And this is broken down by site. So the first figure you see there just accumulates all the data across that year. Breaking it out by site, you can see there's some that have majorly different slopes. Some it's increasing, some it's decreasing. I put a star on one in particular that has a very consistent pattern across the years, and I'll show you a little bit more information for that one. Polymeric anthocyanin, differences by year. Just like with the total anthocyanin, we see that certainly decreasing crop level, we're going to be having higher polymeric anthocyanin content, so that's a benefit, but it's really dependent on year, and certain years we just have more polymeric anthocyanin than others. Again, sites were very highly variable in how the yield affected anthocyanin accumulation. Again, the star there is that same vineyard that shows a very, very steep slope of having a clear yield benefit to reducing crop. And here's the details on that one vineyard in particular. So you can see 2013, 14, and 15 plotted there with yield in pounds per linear foot and how that influenced the tannin, or not tannin, but total anthocyanin content of the fruit. And it really, this is a relationship over time that we'll be able to understand more and try to fine tune for trying to figure out what is the optimum pounds per linear foot. Of course, we don't have nice curves that flatten out that tell us this is where we need to stop with our crop thinning. We aren't seeing that. We see pretty much linear relationships at this point. And this is the tons per acre difference across that same span of time. So between 1.7 and 7.2, so pretty high yields there in 2015. So the anthocyanin question really started to get us thinking a bit more about, okay, so we're not seeing some of these other impacts that we thought we would see. It's not to say that we're not influencing Brix or we're not influencing pH and TA. The difference isn't as big as we thought, but we're seeing it with anthocyanin. And we're really started to wonder, is this is a physiological shift or is it due to microclimate? Because we had the greatest impact in some of our biggest crop level years where we had literally overlapping clusters. And in our no-thinned, you could have clusters just occluding other clusters. Also, we wondered, could there be a problem with leaf pulling? Because when you do crop thinning, normally the crews go through, leaf pull as they're crop thinning, so we might have differential leaf pulling going on. So we decided to look at that a bit more. We looked through all vineyards in 2016, and we were really impressed how everybody did everything pretty standard. They had everything hand leaf pulled, most of them hand leaf pull. They hand leaf pulled the no thin, just like they did the other one. So it was really difficult to say that would be one of those considerations. So at this point, we hypothesize that it isn't necessarily a microclimate effect unless it's the occlusion of clusters in those heavy crop years and not necessarily because of just differentially treating the treatments. And then we also looked at an indicator, which is quercetin, which is a phenolic that really becomes more, there's more of it, accumulates more with more sunlight exposure. So we get that data as part of the ETS rapid phenolic panel, and we started running our total anthocyanin data with quercetin. And some of those vineyards where we see that relationship, we do see an increase in quercetin along with anthocyanin, so more sunlight exposure. It could be a leaf removal effect, but again, some of the other sites don't have this relationship at all. So a summary in terms of wrapping up just kind of the snapshot I gave you today. The site and the year really impacts quality more than yield. It's not to say that yield doesn't influence in a given year. You saw some of those plots, we don't have a flat line. We do see that yield reduction does change Brix, pH, TA. The magnitude of each of those or the slope of that is different for every vineyard and different for every year. The greater yield quality potential we believe that we have greater yield potential and to obtain quality, but it's not necessarily saying that full crop is best. It's not saying that we can leave 100% of the crop out there and we're going to get the best quality ever. I think there are some sites that probably could do it and others that just cannot. Lowest yield, however, is also not a guarantee of quality. We have seen basically if you go too low, you don't see any gain in the fruit quality. Usually we'll see a difference between no thin and one cluster, but we may not see a difference between going any lower than that. Or sometimes we might see a difference between 1.5 and full crop, but we don't see a difference between 1 and 1.5 clusters per shoot. So it really depends on the vineyard and fine-tuning it for individual vineyards. Impacts on vine size. We are trying to do more with that and try to figure out how each site might be able to determine what its yield potential is. We do collect pruning weight data. We have some leaf area data from vineyards, and trying to figure out how that might influence long-term dynamics of managing yield and having a sustainable vineyard. But at this point, we've not actually detected any major differences in our pruning weights. Even after 4 years, we have to run the 2016 data yet, but we're waiting on some of those pruning weights. We also don't see major shifts in nutrient status based on our veraison sampling, which was surprising. A lot of the Californians would have suggested, well, we're going to see major differences in potassium. We don't see that problem, except for in one site that has already low potassium levels. We don't see reduction in nitrogen. One of the things we also don't see is there's no impact so far of yield on yams. So trying to preserve yams, we don't see that being necessarily a tactic for the different components of yan, ammonia N or alpha amino N. Cluster thinning effects may actually not be related so much to source limitations, and because we've got pretty big canopies for the most part. But the amazing thing about this study is we do have some sites that are weaker. And it's really helping us exploit the variability, and we'll hopefully be able to have more information in the future about these things, especially in the long-term trial, to say, okay, at year 6 we see it. Now we've hit to a point where we need to do something or change our practices. Anthocyanin effect, again, how temporal is that? Is it based on the year, the canopy size, the management of that canopy, or is there really a physiological basis there? That I think we still need to understand a bit more. And certainly there's a lot of further statistical analysis that even still needs to be done with our past 5 years of data, and really interesting ways to look at how to take this data and work with it. And even if we don't find major differences in crop level, we'll have now a database of information from each of these producers from their site to look at a lot of different things in unique ways. Continued work. So there's a lot going on in this project, and we're going to continue to look at vine balance effects, specifically trying to do some different source-sink relationship work, especially as we start to have this project into its more mature stages, of having differential crop levels for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Microclimate effects, try to understand those a bit more. And really another part of this, which gets away from traditional viticulture research, is the whole systems analysis. So we've embarked on recognizing that, as a viticulture researcher, I tend to think about the vines and about managing the vineyard, but there's a lot of things that come into play in running the business. So making decisions in the vineyard, the winery, and the economics of all of that. What have the collaborators learned from this process? So we're embarking on a series of surveys and interviews with the collaborators in the project to determine what, in fact, they've learned from it, because I'm pretty sure I don't even know all that they've learned, and hopefully they're willing to share it, and then I can share it with the rest of you in terms of just their observations, which is an important aspect of this, about also helping people make decisions in economic models. What are all the things we need to be worried about? And then developing dynamic metrics that really target what your production goals are, instead of saying to produce the best Pinot, which everybody wants to do, but recognizing that not everybody can sell a $200 a bottle Pinot Noir. They might have to target a $10 or target a $45 bottle. So how are we going to deal with that? So we also have, all these other intricate pieces that come together. What can your vine do, your vineyard do, based on your soil, based on your heat units, your elevation, vine size and balance, and site characteristics. I think that's one of the biggest findings in this study is obviously we've got a region we're working in, but there's a lot of differences that the sites have that go to benefit them. There's just some sites that make better wine than other sites, and I think everybody already knows that. We just don't know how to quantify it, and hopefully we can get there. And certainly the vintage variation is an interesting dynamic that we hope that we can build into prediction models if we have really sound yield data we can work with over the next additional 5 years. Also, a big part of this project is sensory. It's also probably, for me, the most challenging, because I'm not a winemaker. That's why I rely on my colleagues, James Osborne, Elizabeth Tomasino, and certainly the wineries that are involved in this project. Obviously, wine production takes some time. We can't necessarily go and taste the wines right away. We actually usually run those through the OWRI winemaker panel after 2 years of bottle aging. So we don't have a lot of data so far for the past vintages because we've just gone through the panel for the 2014 wines as of December and January. And we're working on that. Basically, it's descriptive analyses that Elizabeth Tomasino leads, and then there's evaluation based on those individual merits of the wine. So they're not really a comparison. What we've decided to do internally is, I felt like that we weren't quite meeting exactly the questions that we wanted to hit or the dynamic questions we'd have with regard to wine quality that leads to decision making in the winery. So we developed in 2016 some new in-house wine evaluation protocols. And these we tested out with some of the winemakers in the group in August. And they seem excited about it, and we're going to unroll that protocol next week. And then they get to hopefully start using that protocol in-house in their winery to gather information about preference, about comparing the quality of the wines to each other, and then also capturing some information about, okay, now how you've changed this, and how is this going to change where you'd put that wine. Would you blend it into this A, B, or C, or what are you going to do with it? So those are the types of questions that aren't typically brought up in sensory that we're hoping we can evaluate as part of this project. And we're going to be sneaky. We want to know what individuals think as well as the whole group. So that's what the new wine quality impact work will look like, and hopefully next time you hear me present, we'll have some data from that. So now is the fun part. We get to go into the wine tasting, and know people better than the people who produce the wines to talk about them. So it was a challenge because there are a lot of the producers have saved their wine for doing analytical work. They've used it in their own tasting rooms to do some outreach about this project. So it was a real challenge, but I was very pleased to have 3 companies who had enough wine to share with you today from this project. I should mention that each of the producers who make wines have to have a big enough project to do about 1 ton fermentations or larger. They can do them larger than that. So they do have the volume, but they don't necessarily bottle all of it and keep that in inventory to share. So we've got some great wines here. The first set of wines is from Chehalem. And we've got Chad Douglas, the viticulturist and vineyard manager here, as well as Wynn Peterson Nedry, the winemaker, to talk about their wines, and then we'll move on to the next 2, or next 4 after that. And I just wanted to mention that the vineyard information is on the slide right now, so you can look at that. And then we're not going to tell you what the identity is until after you've tasted them all. Right.
Okay. On. Chad Douglas from Chehalem Wines, viticulturist. Just a few observations and challenges from the study. Pretty easy for Chehalem to be part of something like this if you know or have met Harry Peterson Nedry, owner, winemaker. Loves data, tables, graphs, anything you can plot on a graph to understand anything. So pretty easy for us, and our winemaking team loves trials, don't they, Katie? Real easy for Chehalem to be part of this. And I think, to Patty's point about a study like this really crossing the continuum, or bridges the continuum between growing grapes, making wine, and then selling the wine. So from a viticultural perspective, my first 2 vintages were 2010 and 11 in Oregon. So kind of thrown in the deep end, but that's what I knew of Oregon, and great wines. But obviously 2011, quite different to 10, huge crop, really did emphasize that we need to have this greater understanding of yield. And so we can kind of, one of my vineyard mantras is to maximize high quality yield, like probably a lot of you. So we needed a greater understanding, and this was very timely, I thought, this project. So quickly on Chehallem's approach, it's a little different to the other the other participants, in the fact that we have 3 specific crop load targets on a tonne per acre basis. I don't know if Patty's going to kick me for that, but so yeah, we don't follow the regular regiment. We have targeted crop yields on a tonne per acre basis. Kind of wanted to make this as practical as possible, so then we can actually start to dial in for this vineyard. What's the magic number, if there is such a thing. So. Really just wanting to, if we have another 2010, what's the number in the back of my mind I should be thinking about from a crop level. Likewise, if we have another 15, how far can we push the boundary? A few of the challenges for Chehalem, I guess, when we do have this targeted tonne per acre, trying to be as consistent as possible year in, year out. But I think we're doing not too bad with our crop estimates. And then, data collection, particularly around harvest, with everything else going on, can be one of the challenges, but we make it work. And lastly, I think I heard it from Ted that he would love to have another 2011 vintage, which I'm not sure how many of you agree with that, but to really see the benefits of this study. So I'll echo those comments, Ted.
I'll go ahead and kind of tell you guys a little bit about the winemaking that we went through in 2014 at Chehalem. And we'll go over, I'll just mention a few of the lab details as well, because for geeks like me and chemistry people, we love data and lab numbers. So as much as we would expect to see a difference in a large difference of yield in 2014, we didn't see a huge difference in the lab numbers, and qualitatively that's the main thing that speaks to me when I'm making decisions on how high we can push it. Chad was mentioning, and if we got another 2015, how high could we crop and still get the best possible yield, but also make it more economic for the winery, or how low can we go if we need to in certain years. So all of our wines we've done in 2-ton fermenters, so we harvest each block separately. We put them into 2-ton fermenters, cold soak them, treat them like we do all of our other Pinot Noirs. Little dry ice to these, cold soak for 5 to 10 days, and then keep it temperature controlled under 90 for ferment. No yeast is added, it's all natural fermentation. And then press them off, typically on the same day if possible. They're harvested on the same day, of course. So we keep all the parameters the same. The thing that I thought was interesting between our wines was that I'm never really sure, based on warm years, whether I prefer slightly lower crops or slightly higher crops. And so I would challenge you guys to try to figure out which one of these 2 wines is the higher crop or the lower crop. But as far as tons per acre, in 2014, our lowest crop was 1.8 tons per acre, our medium crop was 2.6 tons per acre, and our highest crop was 3.4 tons per acre. So this is 2 of those there. The bricks didn't range very far. They ranged from 24.1 bricks to 24.6 bricks, so about a half brick difference between the low and high end. Glucose, fructose was about the same, of course. pH only ranged from 3.59 to 3.65, so right in that same range, side by side. TA was 4.1 to 4.3, so very, very similar numbers all around. Taste-wise, you could tell a little bit of a difference, maybe some concentration differences, but when we're selecting our highest end Pinot Noir, our reserve Pinot, we always go for elegance, balance, delicacy. And if in a warm year, the highest crop gives you the most elegance and gives you the most balance, and that vine is happy, then I don't see any reason to not go with that, especially if it's also the most economic sense making. So I'd like to reiterate what Patty said. It is a vintage by vintage, vineyard by vineyard difference between preferences. And I would be interested to see a 2010 or a 2011 again. I'm not sure that economically our bookkeepers would love to see that vintage again, but I think it would be really interesting for this experiment to see some outlying vintages. From 2012 to 2016, the 5 years we've been part of it, they haven't really skewed much from that warmer side of the range of seasons, but to have a later one and just see how that affected these quality standards when you're tasting through high versus low crop, I think would be super interesting. I'm sure everybody here on the panel makes wines a little bit differently, but we would all agree that, high crop, if you can still get the best quality possible, is ideal.
Thank you, Wynn. So next we have Ken Wright to talk about wines from Carter Vineyard, which actually he was very ambitious. His company did 2 vineyards, so he wins the award of probably the most ambitious in the project. So,
ambitious is one description of that. Yeah. I'm going to go back a little bit in time. It's great to hear Ted talking about what the industry was like not that long ago. It's not that long ago. I was in California making wine for almost a decade before coming here in '86. And everybody loved Oregon, but the word on the street and in the industry there and around the country, when you're selling wine to people who buy wine, was that Oregon was only as good as the year, only as good as the vintage. And then in a tough year, in a cold year, a high crop year, cold year, Oregon really struggled. And I agree with that. That's what I saw. And I think it's what the whole industry was concerned about, that there was some level of inconsistency in the quality of the wines and the intensity of the wines, and we were being judged by that. 1987 was the first year of an acreage contract in the United States, and it happened here. I did it with Canary Hill, and I think there were others that did it in the industry as well. First time. Up until that point, that as far as I'm aware of, no one sold other than by the ton. And that was a problem. The model wasn't a model that works because here in Oregon the weather is just too variable. And when we do have a year that's cold, 84, I don't know how many other than Ted and Harry and myself, there aren't that many people maybe that have been here that were around. And in '84, I don't think there were more than 2 vineyards that got to 20 bricks. Am I right? Maybe 2. I think Cameron, because the vines were young. They were so young and precocious, I think they got to 20. Imagine. So I think '84, and Ted, I don't want this either, but '84 would be the year. A year like that would really make this work sing. It would be dramatic work. And the reason we went to acreage contracts is because we all recognize as an industry we needed to get a hold of crop level. We needed to have some control without hurting a grower. And so we went to all of our people at that time. We said, look, we want a new model, a new way of doing business. We want to pay you by the acre. And we're going to pay you as if you had a full crop. And at that time, it was $5,000 an acre at that time. So it's not all that different. Now it's 10, whatever. It's not that much, actually. In that many years, that's a long time. Anyhow, it began to make all the difference. We began to have the ability to remove crop and be able to lessen the load, the work we're asking of the plant, so that it happens faster. And in a year where you know by the end of spring if you have an issue, And so you can make decisions quite early. We actually are thinning. We don't do it, at the halfway point. We do it immediately after set. As soon as we know we've got a crop, and believe me, I care because I'm the one who owns the business, and I'm paying everybody. And I'm paying for everything we have. And I better have enough money to keep my team intact. And so first we recognize we have a crop, and if we do, then we go in immediately. And we see amazing results by getting in early. But the main thing is to be able to control crop level. In a cold and wet year, cool year. It's the opposite, I think, for a warm year. In 14 and 15, I think for me, I thought it was foolish to remove much crop at all. I mean, we did wings and thirds, and we left everything. And by doing so, in a warm year, you have to remember we are growing the earliest ripening variety of red wine. It does well here because we are on the, we're at the 45th parallel. We're next to the ocean. All these basic, very, very basic influences that work for a cold weather climate variety. But in years that are especially hot, it's more of a challenge. We want the hang time. It's important to have as much time on the vine to develop complex aroma and flavor, and we won't if we race to ripeness. Instead, we'll have an alcoholic, soulless beverage, like Napa Valley Pinot. It's not who we are. We want detail. We want complexity. And our farming approach has everything to do with getting to that place. We have amazing wines, unbelievable. But a lot of that happened because of control of crop. And that's why this is important. But the model isn't that you should just recipe this thing and do it every year. And but it's 1 cluster per shoot or 1.5 or whatever. There's no model that works every year. It requires being light on your feet, aware and flexible to adapt to exactly what's happening to you. And when you do that, it's amazing what you can do through this model of crop control. It helps. It definitely helps. Carter is a vineyard that's down the Eola Hills, the Eola Amity, AVA, on the very southern end, near Highway 22, almost even with Salem. Vineyard that was planted originally in '83. We've been working with it since 1990. We've been farming it since '97. We bought it 2 years ago. It's a beautiful site. It's got a southwest exposure, about 350 feet or so elevation, but a very, very well cared for site for over all the years that it's been there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. So the third set of wines is from Adelsheim, and we have Kelly Wagner, the vineyard manager, and Gina Hennon, associate winemaker, to talk about the wines from. This is 2015 vintage. The other two were 2014.
Thank you. All right, everyone. So Adelsheim has been involved in this project since 2012 when it started. We were interested in signing up for this collaboration because we wanted to understand how various crop levels could impact wine quality, but also vine balance at this particular site. So our vineyard was called Ribbon Springs. It's in the Ribbon Ridge AVA. It's about 550 feet. As you guys can see up there, it was planted in '97, so fairly established vineyard. We did 3 different thinning treatments, or 2. One was unthinned. So you guys can feel free to try the wines that you have in front of you. One of them is a 1 cluster per shoot, and the other is a 1-2-1-2 thinning pattern. And so for us, kind of what Patty just summarized was what we found every single year. The vintages have been rather warm, so maybe that would change over time, but we didn't really see any difference in the vineyard as far as canopy goes. Everything was fairly consistent, and a lot of the ripening was the same, wasn't it? Pretty much the same bricks on the same pick day. So most of what we've been finding has been observed in the wines. So you guys can try those, and I'll let Gina talk a little bit more about what we've been seeing in the winery.
So as Kelly mentioned, we haven't seen any indication that leaving a higher crop load has any impact on the parameters of ripening for bricks, particularly and pH. I think that's an interesting point. We've definitely heard the contrary for as long as I've been in this industry here in the Willamette Valley. So that's an interesting finding, I think, for us. That's not true of every site, and certainly it's not true of every year, but that's what we've been seeing, and I think that's an interesting point. When we got the fruit into the winery, it was all coated, meaning we tasted it blind throughout its entire life. We didn't know which was the 1 cluster per shoot, which was the 1.5, or which was the unthinned, which is the third version of this trial that you do not have. And you know, it was a little controversial when we're tasting. Sometimes we see some fleeting differences in terms of aroma or tannin, But I think the consistent thing that we see as we taste these wines throughout their life is a difference in concentration. And for us, that can be a real important distinction point. These wines are pretty reliably Willamette Valley tier for us, meaning it's a great vineyard site, but this doesn't happen to be the best part of our vineyard, we don't think. They go into a $30 wine, and we're happy with that. If this were a more prized block, that little bit of concentration difference that we see becomes a lot more critical. You know, it can really mean elevating a wine from a $30 price point to a $50 or $100 price point. So I think the context of this tasting is really important. You know, we're comparing these two wines sort of in a vacuum, but the point is how they fit into a blend and what do they do to that blend. Do they enhance it in terms of the concentration? Do they tend to dilute it a little bit? And what we find when we put these wines into a larger blend is they dilute it a little bit. So we tend to prefer, with that in mind, the lower crop yield. If we were making a Willamette Valley tier wine and that was our goal, our decision making would be quite different. We would be much happier having a little bit of a higher yield and carrying more fruit because, as other people mentioned, there's an economic reward for that. So it really depends on what the context is of your winery and what is your eventual goal with the wine itself. Where do you expect it to go? Where do you want it to head? In what direction?
So at this point, is anybody a brave soul who wants to comment on their wines or the wines that you are tasting, or have any suspicions as to differences in concentration? Has everybody had a chance to taste through all of them? Well, that'll be, if everybody's ready, I can show you what they actually were. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Let's do.
So I guess a raise of hands for how many people thought you could tell a difference between 1A and B. Okay. And how about for 2A and B? How about 3A and B? So I think everybody's pretty consistent. They're seeing differences, at least.
Ask for a
Preference. So does somebody, let's compare within producer, a preference for the ones. How many for A? 1A. Okay, 1B. Oh, I think 1B just won it. Okay, so 1B, let's see. Okay, for the twos. 2A. Okay, how about 2B? Oh, I think 2B won it this time. Okay, the threes. How many for 3A? 3B? Or no difference in... So how many felt there was no difference between the ones? How about no difference in the twos? No difference in the threes? Oh, interesting. So you ready for the reveal? Okay. So, for 3? Yep. So for 1A was a 3.25 tons per acre. And in that year, for 2014, it turned out to be 0.92 pounds per linear feet. And then the 2.5, which was, I think, the preferred 1B, was the 2.5 tons per acre, and that was 1.27 pounds per. I must have those mixed up. Actually, they're backwards. It would be that 0.92 pounds per linear foot, not the other way around. And I think everybody liked the 2B, except for Harry, I think. So somebody said not 2B. So 2B for Carter Vineyard, Ken Wright Cellars, was the preferred one, and that was actually the no thin at 1.5, 1.5 pounds per linear foot versus the 1 cluster per shoot. And then for the Adelsheim, the 1.5 cluster was, I think that the preferred one. It was the 1A, or the 3A versus the 3B. So that was the 1.99. And actually, I think Adelsheim for that year was the record breaker. They had the most yield of any vineyard in the project. So, yeah.
You have a question?
Yes, please.
Yep. Any questions for
Yes, please, Patty.
Yep.
Could somebody tell me whether they've thinned to, or whether you did a shoot per linear foot count?
Yes, we did. Yep. We have shoots per linear foot, clusters per linear foot. We've got tons and tons of data. My faculty research assistant, Amelia, who's somewhere in the room, put together the spreadsheet for the statistician, and I think it took her about a full work week to put all of our data together. So yeah, we do have the density, but I don't have that, off the top of my head at this point. Within Vineyard, yes. It was consistent.
Was the vineyards just in bunks, or did you do a green thin horizon as well? Were the vineyards thinned once, or did you do a green thin at horizon?
Yeah, correct. The protocol was to come in at lag and have one thinning pass. Yeah, at lag.
Sure.
I'm happy to comment on the Chehalem wines. I see that I maybe be opposed to Harry here, but he prefers the more cropped version. So Harry prefers B, which is 2.5 tons per acre. I prefer A, which is 3.25. I guess it depends on what you're going for. I like the elegance in the higher crop in this instance because I think it does have a little bit more brightness personally. And in a hot year, that's something that I'm looking for. It's not Coca-Cola. We aren't making the same product every year, but if we can be consistent in our stylistic choices, and if you are going for an elegant wine, you stick with that elegant procedure. You do fewer punch downs per day. You do a few more pump overs. You keep it more elegant, and it's still just as balanced in my opinion. It might not be quite as concentrated, so if I was going for a more concentrated style, I might prefer B, but I like them for their own individual reasons. If we were doing this at a different vineyard, I might prefer the more concentrated one, but this vineyard, it can be quite rich and full-bodied as it is, so to be able to do something a little bit more elegant in a very hot year is pretty cool, and especially if your vine is still in balance and you still get really nice fruit.
I just have one thing to add. That was a good point, Wynn, that this is just another tool that we have. It's a little dial that we can try to make some assumptions about and guess what the vintage is going to be like. And it's not just punch downs and things like that, which we also do and think about, but we could ripen more fruit in a warmer year. That's absolutely a pretty easy thing to do. Again, it depends on what you want from each of the vineyards and the individual blocks, but it's another little finesse point that we can make changes in.
I didn't have the wines in front of me today. We only had 4 setups, so I fell on my sword. But just speaking, we've tasted the wines in-house, and from 14, we actually preferred in-house the lower crop level as a group. In 15, we preferred the higher crop level as a group. And so it's not terribly consistent, but we have to remember exactly what Ted said at the very beginning. We're dealing with years that are actually quite warm. We really do need to see the significance of what this means. It needs to be a cool year. For us, what I think surprised me in the vineyard was the fact that the pruning weights were so similar. I was really surprised. I would have thought that crop level would have had a more significant impact on printing weights. I mean, ground cover is way more impactful than crop level. Ground cover can really bring a vineyard to a screeching halt, or if you're clean tilling, send it into oblivion, out of control. So, whereas the crop level really doesn't seem to have as much of an impact, which I found that really, really interesting over these years. Buddy. Forgive me? Absolutely. I mean, if you're dealing with a vineyard like, say, Abbey Ridge, you're at 900 feet, crop level's a huge issue. You just can't, in a traditionally average year, it's a struggle. And you have to keep that crop low, period. And it does make a massive difference. We've done side-by-sides for, since the 80s, and it makes a massive difference. Yeah.
Hi, I had a question regarding, on your site, your 2B and your 3B, you had no thinning for the 2B site, and you ended up with 1.51 pounds per foot of crop. And on 3B, you had 1 cluster per shoot, which is an extreme thinning, and 1.59 pounds per foot. Could somebody comment on that?
You see what he's talking about, Patty?
So these are two different sites. So the pounds per linear foot is, so Carter, and this is, you can speak to them, but having seen both of the sites, Carter is much smaller vine canopy than Adelsheim. And also the cluster sizes are usually smaller. So that's why we're seeing that difference there. I mean, it's different clone too, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And very different planting density. Right?
Different clones. It's a 9x6 density. Of course, density plays a huge role in crop level as well. But it's a kind of a middle of the road, typical older vineyard planted in 83, 9x6. But it's also, Carter is essentially a rock pile. It's just we break equipment every day we're out there.
And the vigor level from Carter is much lower and really, honestly, very well balanced. I mean, it's nice. I don't think you probably even have to hedge more than once, right? And that versus Adelsheim.
Twice usually. Yeah. Twice.
And just to comment on the Adelsheim 3B, our vineyard sounds like the complete opposite of Carter Vineyard. It's quite vigorous. It's got lots of everything that it wants to be happy. It's a 5x7 spacing. Like I said, there are 20-year-old vines, just shy of 20 years old, and it was about 2.95 or 3 tons per acre that year. And I think in that thinning treatment, we were at about a 200-gram cluster. Yeah. It's a cluster inside of a cluster.
I think I could get some attention.
So before I get kicked out of the room, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the industry collaborators, because this is a significant effort on their part, a huge time commitment, and I feel very happy that so many people joined the project. I know James Osborne and I talked about this at the outset. We said if we can get 10 companies involved with this after 10 years, we'll be really happy. And we had 10 companies in year 1. And we actually grew from that over the years. So I thank all of them, and also thank you for being here today, those of you who have wines to share. Funding, doing this work, even though a lot of the work is done by in-kind donation of the collaborators themselves, funding was provided by a pilot project funds from the Oregon Wine Research Institute to get us started, and then the Oregon Wine Board also funded it basically from 2013 onward as partial funding as well. So wouldn't be possible without that support. ETS Labs donated the fruit composition work. Precision Agri Labs gave us a reduction in the tissue nutrient analysis costs. Crop Production Services helped us get some of those samples into Precision Agri Labs. OSU Extension donated some money so I could get to some of these sites, so I could rent a motor pool car, so that was good. USDA, Paul Schreiner, his lab had done 3 years worth of some physiological studies in this work, so I want to thank his lab for that. And certainly past and present members of my lab who have spent a lot of time collecting and taking care of berry samples for this project, and my faculty research assistant, Amelia Doyle, who's been a part of the project. Many of you in industry have recently met her. She joined the program this year, so I want to thank all of those people as well. And I think that's it. Any final questions? I don't know if we have time, but all right, thank you.